All right. Happy Monday once again. So, hope everybody's continuing to have a good week. At least, it's Monday, but it'll be the week of weeks. Um, I'll jump into the agenda. All right. Backlog refinement office hours, to me, has run its course. I thought it was a great idea as everybody was ramping up and we were learning how to work with each other and how to approach some of these issues and everybody getting used to the um, the problem domain that we're in. But I think we've outgrown it. And the reason that I say we've outgrown it is very rarely do you all bring items to discuss or anybody other than and it's usually talking about priorities or planning. So I've seen people are already responding to this, but I'd like to open it up so it's not focused internally on backlog refinement, but open it up to larger GitLab. And I'm not talking engineering, I'm talking sales, I'm talking professional services, solution architects, TAMs, the like, because there's just the uptick is noticeable on requests and for our assistance, and some of the practices that I'm seeing done by the field, I would like the opportunity to correct and show them how we want them to use things like our vendor templates, and answer questions. And so making it open it up so that we can do more of a Q&A. And that doesn't say that we can't use that time to refine sticky issues, but it would compete with other things that are on the agenda. Are y'all okay with this change? Three plus one say yes. All right. All right. Next one. I'm dragooning Taylor, but I'll speak unless he just wants to.
Go for it.
Okay. All right. Deprecations 14.0 is coming. We have this 90-day announcement period that we need to do before we remove things. So if we want to remove items in 14.0, we got to start thinking about deprecations now, because that's going to come around April or May of 2021. So issues filed, if you have items in mind that you would like to see replaced, deprecated, or removed, please contribute to this issue. We've got some items that are filed there just to get the conversation started, but we do need to come up with a crisp list so that we can do the replacement work, do the formal deprecation work, and then do the removals come 14.0. Any questions about this? Because we're actually on time for this conversation for the first time that I can remember.
The only thing I would call attention to is that we've mentioned the potential SimGrip transition, and there's a pretty good thread about thoughts there. This is something that we probably do want to figure out what our strategy is sooner as opposed to later. So yeah, take a look at that. Feel free to put any comments there.
Alrighty. Neil.
Cool. Thanks sorry for the late addition, but there's been some conversation around the security compliance page, for access to core users so they can start configuring things like SAST and secrets that are available now. We've uncovered a lot of enterprise versus core code-based restrictions, things like that. So I think it leads back into that conversation about having an architectural discussion. So I see Taylor's been kind of adding some commentary to that thing. So my main questions, like, what is our plan? What are the expectations around implementation? And I see, Taylor, you mentioned it's our next front-end priority, but I definitely anticipate a lot of back-end work, making sure the data is exposed. We have those APIs. So just wanted to raise this and make sure we were setting expectations around capacity in the next couple milestones. And then I also really want to have a design, kind of a project kickoff type of session where we talk about this. That's funny, Becca just joined, but like really learn what this initiative is all about, and then feed that into a technical discovery session as well. We can start to uncover things. So thoughts, and Taylor, feel free to represent your stuff.
Yeah, so there's a couple of different things here. This is surprisingly much more complicated page than it looks at face value. There's a lot of very bizarre edge cases that we have come to learn about. So from my perspective, like, this probably should be promoted to an epic. There's a couple pieces to this. One would be update the screenshots in the new discovery page. They're currently old. That should hopefully just be something easy. Becca, I think, has provided all of those screenshots. So that should be a simple update. We then have to kind of go through the page as it exists today and try to ungate it for its feature check and make sure that we're properly checking all of the cases where you should or shouldn't be able to see certain configuration options. For now, I think that's maybe a little bit easier given we only have one configuration UI. We'll have to look at the permissions for that, which are the user roles, and then we'll also need to look at how we're doing licensing for that. I suspect we may hit some of the problems where we're not granular enough with our license. So we'll have to look into what the best direction is there. And then the last piece would be exposing our configuration MR button, not the UI page for SAST. So basically what we initially released, which just goes straight to an MR.
Yeah, not the full configuration, but yeah, just enabling SAST through a one click.
So the idea with this whole thing basically is that all GitLab users should be able to see this page. It's an entry point to learn about all of the different things that we've got. It gives us a consistent place to link people throughout the product, which we surprisingly don't have today. We can't link somebody to a place to learn about all of our security functionality in the product. It will handle basically being smart about what features you've got access to. Again, helping people understand that they can run certain types of scans and get them configured if they're using Auto DevOps or not. I feel like there's one other piece. Oh, and it has links to the documentation too. And jumping from not knowing something exists to the correct docs is apparently a very tricky problem for our customers that they cannot figure out for themselves. Questions about that?
So this page, through the recent additions we've made, we've learned that it's heavily driven off of pipeline status, which inherently isn't a bad idea because it's real, but it's hard, and it's hardwired. Like every single row in there is dependent. So I recently added on-demand DAS scans, and that's not dependent on like a pipeline scan. So it's really hard to like fake something. I had to essentially fake a data row and adding all the tests around that. So I think that's one of my main considerations is this new page. It's going to be very lightweight for core users, right? We don't have all the data. And like you're mentioning, the license compliance, like, yeah, all the granularity. So it sounds like we need to pick off like one by one, feel like what the data looks like. But I'm envisioning us kind of revamping this and how we're exposing this data. And maybe the back end works similarly to how it does today, but in terms of how front end consume this, it's a lot more flexible than it is now.
So I just have a
Tom.
question about this related
Sure.
to like
Lucas.
SAS specifically, which is, I know at least with the configuration page, obviously that's a SAS thing right now, but I know that at least Nicole was looking at increasing that as well. So I'm curious how much of this work is scoped to SAST versus something we'd be more genericizing.
It is something that the dependency scanning team is working on right now. They're going to, as a first pass, start with the MR only option. So no configuration UI. That I believe is scheduled for work to start in 13.7, but I believe it'll be 13.8 or 9 before they'll actually release anything. So we'll be well ahead of them. But anything we do here should make it as easy as possible to allow other scan types to do the same thing that we're doing.
All right, I'll ask my one question, and I couldn't think of a way to write it, so I'll vocalize first and write second. Scope of this is limited to within GitLab projects, right?
Correct.
Okay.
We're
So
not biting off anything about non-project level configuration.
Okay. I'm just trying to understand the boundaries between what we control within the UI versus the container security group and its new charter are responsible for. And I'm still internalizing the distinction. So that's why I'm asking. Okay. And at the risk of making this a issue that threatens to try to solve world peace, do we need to decompose the feature category that is SAST to figure out the independent components of it? Or in other words, the individual features that make up the category that we want to independently license?
I would say yes,
Okay.
based on some of the things we know we want to do longer term. I don't know if it's something that we need to do initially, but it's definitely something that we should think about.
Anything
I definitely,
go ahead.
I definitely think that's a prerequisite for the for establishing the permissions, because we really need to rethink how that permission model is laid out, which is currently categorical, not feature based.
Okay. More to come. All right. I'll be quiet now.
So what are our next steps here? I guess is my big question, just so we're on top of this.
I mean, I think we've now proven that this should be promoted to an epic and then building out maybe some of those sub-issues. I will click the button and then can outline a few placeholder image or epics or issues, sub-issues.
And does this project feel big enough? So for SaaS config UI, we had that really effective sync session weekly. Does this project feel big enough that we should think about something like this, or at least do a couple rounds?
I think the license piece of this probably justifies that, given that it's a problem that we've hit in a couple of different other places, and we need to make sure that however we do it is flexible enough for the other sort of feature control points that we need across Secure.
So as part of the initial issue creation, Taylor, would you mind explaining kind of the structure and the focus topics? And maybe we can centralize sync discussions or async, whatever, just around that, so we're focusing on the right priority. And we can think about DRIs once we have those issues as well. Cool, thanks.
All right. Last item. We actually got to demos this week. So Lucas, you're up, sir.
Cool. So I was just going to do a quick demo of the work I was doing for Q3 on augmenting severities. So let me screen share. All right. Can we see the agenda?
Yep.
Yes. Okay, cool. All right. So for Q3, I was working through this epic, which was primarily around improving our data quality. So in terms of normalizing our data, we have a fair bit of scanners that do not report a severity. Based on this handy dandy super readable chart, we are missing SOBELO, security code scan. The ones that recently changed are Flaw Finder, Node.js scan, eslint, and Brakeman. So a fair bit. So we've done a pretty decent job by improving that. So this is the basic breakdown: is Brakeman, eslint, Flaw Finder, etc. So for some of these, it was a bit easier because in the case of something like Flaw Finder, once you actually read through the docs, they say this attribute that we return as risk is essentially a severity score instead. And so in this case, we just went back through and remapped confidence to severity. I was looking into the original decision here. I didn't really figure out a good reason why we are using confidence initially, but it also matters a lot less than it used to. We don't even expose confidence in the UI anymore. It's just something that customers don't really care about, it seems. So that's fine. In this case, we actually remapped confidence to severity because according to the description here, it's more around risk. And I personally would say risk is a lot closer to severity. In the case of Brakeman, that one is also similar, but according to Brakeman's docs, they actually conflate the two. And someone actually asked about this. So in that case, the author considers it one and the same. So in this case, we actually did a similar remapping effort, and this was, instead of moving confidence to severity, we now report it in both cases. So severity is informed by the confidence level. There is a really good methodology for how we're doing severity here, and there's an outstanding issue on what exactly severity means for our own tools, but by and large, we try and map this to something similar to a CVSS score. Now, I started with those two because those two are kind of the simplest. It's a pretty quick, easy change. But some of these, it's a bit more complex because we don't always have a provided value to map to. eslint is probably one of our simplest analyzers. It doesn't really have any concept of what a severity or a risk score would be. So we can't really do much with this one. It just gives us either it fails or it doesn't fail. It's about as simple as a linter can get. So for this one, we essentially have to add a mapping layer on top of it to remap things. If you look at something like the description mapping, we actually have a hard-coded map within our analyzer where we take the rule name and we give it a human readable description. So we need to do a very similar thing here where once we have a score that we actually assess, we can map it within our analyzer. In some cases, we can map these, we can contribute these back upstream. I don't really think that there's a way of doing that for eslint because there's no real metadata attribute on top of an eslint rule set, but other analyzers are more amenable to that change. So the one I really want to talk about here is Sobolo. Sobolo, our Elixir one, is pretty interesting because the way it works, you take a module. In this case, let's look at XSS. And then there's some various detection rules. So we have a category like cross-site scripting. And then we have the actual, here we go. So we have this parent one that is the actual like rule name, XSS. And then we have a context by which it's detected. So send response, raw, HTML content type, these are all methods for detecting this specific rule type. So what I did when I started looking at Sobolo is first mapped all of the severity categories. And then for each one of these modules, we have each one of these detection rules. So in some cases, the detection rule is essentially the same. Raw and send response here, we map to a CWE 79, which is improper neutralization of input during web page generation. But then in some cases, like this one, this is a missing content type. So we're more vulnerable to a cross-site scripting attack with a missing content type. So this one was 644 based on HTTP headers. And in this case, it's a bit more nuanced. In some cases, I just kind of ended up Googling this. So for this, we have a path traversal. So I'll say CWE path traversal and 23. Read through this, it looks about right. And so we end up taking this one and mapping path traversal to CWE 23. For each one of these, it could probably be 23, but it would require actually looking through each individual module to determine that. So we have a CWE, and CWEs are basically categories. They don't actually tell us too much there about what the actual severity or risk rating would be. So for that, we need something like a CVSS. Since CVSS is an actual scoring system, then we can go through here and we can calculate what a base score would be. Now, CVSS is made up of three groupings here. We have a base score, a temporal score, and an environmental score. Now let's take the path traversal here as a good example of this. So say send file. All right, so directory traversal and send file, and that is, it detects if there is a unprotected string getting used in the send file module here, and it raises that issue. So if we're actually calculating our CVSS score from it, we can say the first attribute here for exploitability is an attack vector. So this is essentially, where can this be exploited? Do I need to be on the physical machine or on the local network or adjacent network or network? So this is pretty much 99% of the time is network for us because, well, we don't really know. Now, the attack complexity is how complex the attack would be. So this is whether it only can occur on Mondays, whether it requires a very specific configuration, series of things like that. In this case, path traversal, you're just passing in a string. So I'd say that's fairly low attack complexity. Privilege is required, like whether a user is logged in, whether they're an admin. And again, we don't really know here. And so in these cases, we have to be fairly generic because we're not looking at a specific user's case within their application. We're just trying to establish like a base score to look at first. So in this case, I would go with none because we should default to the highest risk here that we're assessing for individual customer. User interaction, whether this one's a bit confusing. It's whether or not we need a user other than the attacker to participate. So waiting for a user to send in their input first. So in this case, I'll say none because a user can trigger the path traversal directly. Scope is an attribute about whether the affected component is isolated or whether it would actually, the exploitation of the vulnerability affects a different component. So in this case, if you have a content security policy of like a same origin policy, you can trigger a script tag and alert inside someone's browser, but it doesn't affect other users. It doesn't affect other systems. So for path traversal, this could be fairly damaging. If we're imagining like the worst case for a send file path traversal, you're overriding a sudoers file or you're overriding a password file. So we're going to say scope change there because it could change the scope from the vulnerable component to other components. Confidentiality impact, potentially high. Let's go with high. Integrity, similar, high. Availability, I don't really know how you use a path traversal to take down a system, but I think it's possible. Overwriting a sudoers file could be a good example of that. So also high. Cool. So this calculator base score of a 10, which is critical. There's a lot of nuance in this. So this is kind of the part where I would definitely pull in the AppSec team for evaluating this score. But as a baseline, we have a score of 10 here. That's as high as it goes. The temporal score is something that can affect it based on a, let's say if there's a fix, if someone releases a patch for this path traversal vulnerability, then that's how the temporal score affects the base score. If it's unproven that the exploit exists, then that actually lowers the score from a 10 to a 9.1 because it's just theoretical. And other things, an official fix lowers it even more. So this is the basic way of calculating the CVSS score. And assuming that I did this right, does anyone have any questions, clarifications about this base calculation? Or corrections if they think I'm wrong? Okay. Feel free to jump in anytime. I feel like I'm talking a lot. So I'm going to copy this vector here.
So for the environmental scores, will that ever affect us, or is it just not applicable in this instance?
Yeah. So I think that one issue with this basic methodology is we're establishing a base score that could work for all of the findings we discover. An individual finding within a user's application should have a temporal and environmental score, but it's not something that we can assume just based on what we're doing here. If we find a leaked passcode in the Rails application, then the tempora score would be affected by whether or not we've revoked that secret yet, and the environmental score, whether or not that commit has been pushed up and someone can see it or something like that. But I don't think that if what the goal is here is establishing kind of like a generic base severity to use for our rules, we can't really do that.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
Cool. So I was just going to copy over here. This is the link. And that's our new score. So going back, that was an overall score of a 10. So I will paste 10 here. And that's critical. Okay, so that's how we calculate that one. I haven't really looked through these, but as a baseline, I would probably set all the past reversals the same. I don't think that they vary too much in these modules, but that's worth a check before I do that. So, oops. Cool. So that's essentially how we came up with these scores here. One addition, I guess, two additional things I would say. There isn't always a easy score to go with here. I don't really trust myself as like not a security professional to establish these. So having the security team review all these scoring and CWE mappings is one thing. Whether or not we even need to map to a CWE is another. Maybe we can just go straight with CVSS score, but I personally find the CWE helps me like understand, and maybe we want to attach it as an identifier. Now I talked to Julian about this because I was curious what he thought about the basic methodology. And one thing that he mentioned that they were working on, which I think is super cool, is this CVSS component mapping. So what they did is they actually pulled all National Vulnerability Database submissions back to like 2017, I think. And they pulled out the CWE, the case count, and individual aggregations for each of the levels per attribute in the scoring vector. So if we look back at this here, we have the attack vector, network, adjacent network, local, physical. And I guess I forgot to mention the basic syntax is attack vector, network, attack complexity, low. So if we actually look at the scoring here, we can see that the one that we just did, which is CWE 23, there is no 23. So that either means no one has ever submitted CWE 23 to the National Vulnerability Database. And that probably means that that is not the CWE we want to be using. So maybe I Googled and I chose the wrong CWE. There is, however, a bit of a hierarchy here. So if we look at CWE 23, 23 is actually a child of 22 here, which is improper limitation of a path. So if we go back here, it looks like there was 10,000 instances of CWE 22 submitted. So that's probably a better CWE to use here for the base scoring. In my mind, I would imagine specificity is better, but it seems like people use the more generic ones from what I've seen. So for CWE 22, it looks like 90% of submissions for this one use a network attack vector, and 97% use a low attack complexity. So this actually provides a really good mechanism by looking at the previous NVD data to see if our scoring is actually accurate. This is something that the vulnerability research team is actually using to ensure that their results are accurate when evaluating risk scores when people submit requests for CVEs. But in our case, it's just useful for fact checking that our severity ratings are accurate. So I can go through here, determine this. Some of these are a bit less clear, like for 18, looks like exactly 50% of people said it's low or high attack complexity, but there is just a little bit of nuance there. So that's where we end up here. And in this case, in the case of something like CWE 644, I'm of the opinion that this is the right CWE, but because it's not in the NVD, we end up calculating this score from the parent of CWE 644, which is 116. And that's where we end up with the scores. There's still a few missing, but it takes a lot of manual effort to get there. Cool. And then just there's another tab here for eslint, which is less far along. Any questions?
So Lucas, so are we keeping record of the link that you used for calculation somewhere in our project? I understand it's in the spreadsheet right now. So are we planning to, so why should we put the link that this is how we calculated this score?
Yeah, there's a clarify severity. I don't remember the name of the issue.
Okay.
I think it's linked on here, but there is an issue that we have, which is essentially documenting how we normalize severity, which I'm not sure where that one is. Oh, I also props to Zach for this one. Forgot to mention that, but his work on updating Node.js scan to v4, which is funnily enough v015. This one added severity to our Node.js scan as well. So that was another awesome win to get severity in another analyzer. But to your question, Sakat, the idea here is that we will actually no longer need this spreadsheet. It's just something that's using to figure these out. Once this list is complete, we basically just take this score and similar way to that mapping we had in the eslint analyzer, we can actually put this mapping between the rule name and the score to return. Actually, I guess it would be this one because we use a textual severity. But we can put that directly into the analyzer to return with our data, and that gets us the data immediately, and then look to contribute this data back upstream to the tool if they are interested. If not, that's fine, we do it ourselves, but ideally, SoBelow cares about severity enough where we can include this in their data directly.
Okay.
Most of this spreadsheet, the CVSS comparison, et cetera, and the calculator are just for figuring out the score in the first place.
Okay.
That was super helpful, Lucas. I saw your comment about doing a release post. Yes. What analyzers does it need to cover?
I think just Brakeman is the only one that we didn't include in 13.5, but Brakeman now includes a severity.
Okay, perfect. All right, we'll get that written.
Cool.
Something to think about, that we get this question from customers of what classes of vulnerabilities do you cover? Your spreadsheet is exactly what I would love to be able to give to customers, but I recognize that that's not a good way to do that. So like, think on that one.
Yeah, that's one thing that's been very difficult. And in this case too, this group right here, we talked about this a little bit, but one thing that becomes apparent when you're looking through every rule from these is that we do have a lot of, I wish I had a different word than impurity in our analyzers, but one good example is GoSec includes a hard-coded credentials password. I feel like to properly do this, we should probably exclude hard-coded credentials from our static analysis rule set. That's something for secrets. But in a similar way, here's this group of vulnerabilities discovered in SoBelow that are basically all dependency scanning. So this one looks within the, it checks your dependency file, looks for affected versions, and complains about it with the CVE. One of the nice things about this is that we can actually take the CVE and pull the exact CVSS score that it was submitted with. So in that case, we don't have to calculate ourselves, which is why it's so much easier for dependency scanning to have a severity. But that does mean that we have like this group of rules that aren't really static analysis checks, but we include them anyway. So it's definitely interesting going through these manually and figuring out what kind of, I wouldn't say they're data quality issues, but they're data considerations. Cool. Well,
I'll ask
we're over time.
I'll ask an orthogonal question and then I'll be quiet. When an analyzer goes outside of its lane, so below emitting secrets detection reports or vulnerability or dependency scanning type reports, should the analyzer emit more than one report type?
No.
Fair enough. I wanted to ask the question because that's what came to mind.
If anyone else has opinions there, please jump in. That's just
my one thought with that would be that we'd have to be really good at deduplication, right? Because potentially multiple, scanners or analyzers surfacing the same issue. So we'd want to probably talk with Threat Insights on cares deeply about.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point too, because if we are reporting it from multiple locations, well, I guess it's like asking your text editor to check your white space and it starts complaining about your spelling. Like it's not something that you want from it necessarily, but it definitely would cause duplicate information too.
I will resist the temptation to jump on a soapbox. Okay. Alrighty. As noted, we're over time. So thank you, everybody. Hope you have a good rest of your week. And since there's nothing going on the rest of the week, so it should be kind of quiet. I'm kidding, completely kidding. Have a good rest of your week. We'll talk soon. See ya.